When I sit down to take a course from Pluralsight, or if I sit down to learn any new technology, I usually need some sort of lab environment, a safe environment that I can practice on the technology without affecting anything in production. So I like to build lab environments, usually a virtualized lab environment. But there's a couple of challenges with that. First of all, it could take hours, well, more than hours when you download all the software. It could take days to build this lab environment, depending upon the complexity that it needs to be. And also, as I'm working on technologies, I make mistakes and I want to be able to easily go back or revert that lab environment. And it's been quite a bit of a challenge. Well, I'd like to introduce to you a tool that might make your life easier. I'm Jason Helmick, an author here at Pluralsight, and I, along with some of my friends, have been putting together a tool to help you quickly and automatically build lab environments. First, let me define what I mean by a lab environment. Think about this. You want to have an environment where you can work on and practice the technology. Whether you're taking a course here from Pluralsight or working on some technology yourself, or maybe presenting at a conference, some of the challenges that you face are things like you got to first download all the software. So those are usually the ISO files, the ISOs, right? The different operating systems that you're going to need. Then you need to create, if you're doing this virtualized, you need to create the virtualized networking, what IP addresses you're going to set it to. Then you got to build all those virtual machines, giving them the names that they need and getting those operating systems installed. But wait, you're not done yet, because now you usually have to follow some lengthy configuration guide that explains to you all the steps to go through to configure each of these machines. Maybe like your client machines needs to have the remote server administration tools added to it. You might need to build a domain controller and add some users and groups to it and install additional features to it, and then build some additional servers, get those joined to the domain. Again, this is something that can take hours or even days, and this is assuming you did it all correct the first time and you didn't make any mistakes. And then as you're using this environment, as it becomes dirty and you want to be able to go back and try things again, now it can be a challenge to reset this entire environment. And this is where the tool, the AutoLab as we call it, kind of comes into place. This tool will build these environments for you automatically and will configure all the servers for you automatically. And if an author has created a course at Pluralsight and is participating in using this tool, they can have the configuration already made for you so that all you have to do is run this and everything gets created for you. And this creates the safe playground for you to be able to work in. Also, you'll be able to easily snapshot and then refresh this. And that means that you can, well, recover it quickly and easily back to a certain starting point of your choice. So let me show you what we're going to do in this video on how to work with the AutoLab. First up is we're going to tell you where to find the AutoLab. And what my goal is not only where to find it, but how to download it and get it installed on what we're going to call is your host computer. The idea is that your host computer can be a laptop, can be running Windows 10 or Server 2016, or it could be a standalone machine. And we're going to install Hyper-V on this. Well, the AutoLab is going to install Hyper-V for you and set everything up and create all the VMs for you. And that's where we get to configuring your very first lab. I want to show you how to go in and configure this so that and run the configurations that have been created for you and what to expect as they execute. Then how to verify that the configuration is complete. This is going to take some time, and the first time you run it, since it's got to download files and all that, it's going to take longer, but every time you run it after that, it gets faster, but we do need to know when the configurations are complete. Also, we want to take a look at how to start, stop, and snapshot those environments so that you can easily and quickly recover back to a starting point of your choice. At the end, of course, you might want to just get rid of this lab environment and switch to something completely different. Well, removing the lab environment and switching back is pretty easy to do. So with that, let's get started with where to find the AutoLab. So the first couple of questions: where do I download it? How much does it cost? What, do I have to license it and buy separate copies for multiple friends and all that kind of stuff? And the answers are very simple. First of all, it's an open source GitHub project, which means it's free. And it's not only free, the license is what we call an MIT license, which means not only can you use it as often, give it to your friends, it's yours. You can do anything you want with it, including contribute to it if you'd like, or take it and just change it into whatever you want it to be. So those are the easy questions. Now, where do you get it? Well, here's the URL for it. So the location is on GitHub. It's the Jason Helmick. It's ps-autolab-environment. In fact, why don't we go out and take a look at what you will find when you get there? Now, if you haven't worked with a GitHub project before, when you first put in that URL right there, it's going to look kind of strange. You're going to get this page with all of these things on it, and you'll scroll down and you'll see, well, what am I supposed to download? What am I supposed to click on? What am I supposed to do? And the answer is, you know what? I wanted to remove the confusion out of that. So what we have down here is a README, and I really encourage that you check the README because we are enhancing this and adding features to it, and we'll explain that here in the README. Now, the PowerShell Automated Lab environment is based upon another GitHub project called Virtual Engines Lability. This is kind of the underlying infrastructure, and what we've added to it is basically control commands that will make your life easier on getting this set up, and we've added the configurations. Here we'll tell you what the current version is, and then down here you can download that current version, and we're going to come back and do that when we do the installation for it. But I want to show you a couple of other things. There are a list of requirements, what you have to have on your host computer that you're going to install this on. Now that computer can be 2016 or Windows 10. And you're going to need to have Windows Management Framework 5 on those, which those do come with already. You're going to need an internet connection, and right around 16 gigabytes of RAM would be great, and 100 gigabytes of disk space as the minimum requirements to run this. Now, as you go down through here, and I'm going to be pointing this out later, we also have instructions of exactly what to do once you download this. Now, the reason I'm pointing this out is this can get confusing. I'm going to go through every single one of these and demonstrate them for you to remove that confusion. So we'll go through these steps together. Also, some other things to keep in mind is that I will show you this. There are instructions while you're running the lab that will be displayed to remind you of the commands that are available. Yes, these are PowerShell commands that we've created for you to run. It doesn't matter if you don't have a lot of experience with PowerShell, it'll work out just fine. And so it'll tell you how to run the lab, get it set up. It'll tell you how to stop and snapshot the lab and how to remove the lab. And these are the things that I will demonstrate to you. So having said that, why don't we go ahead and get started with downloading and installing the AutoLab, and then I can show you how to run a configuration. You've downloaded and installed software before, so this is no bigger challenge than that. All you have to do is download the zip file and extract the zip file. But let's go through this together and follow the instructions together. So as you can see here, the instructions say download the zip of this repository to your host computer and then extract it to your C drive. And it gives you an example of what that's going to look like. Well, let's go here and do that. And I'm going to scroll up here, go to the current release, click on that, and that'll take you to the release and any information about that release. And what I'd like is a zip file. Now, by default, Windows is going to want to download this to your downloads folder, which is fine for me. You can even then click once it's done, view the downloads. It's pretty small. I'm going to go into File Explorer and show it to you graphically this way so that you can see it. Here's the downloads folder, and that's what it downloaded. Now, the instructions, step 2 says to extract this. So I'm going to right click on it and say extract all. And the location I'm going to give it is just going to be C:\/ and let it extract. Once it's completed the extraction, this is kind of like, okay, I've downloaded and I've got the source files ready to go. Let me just go and show you. Here's what it created for me. Now, you'll notice that it extracts it and it has the version number in it. That's fine. What we're going to do is follow the instructions and then run a setup program in here to install the AutoLab. We're going to do that from PowerShell, but let's check those instructions real quick. I want you to see something that occurs here, and I want to kind of get you to miss what might be a problem that some people run into. First of all, it says open up PowerShell with administrative privileges. It's a run as administrator, and then set the execution policy to bypass. Now, the reason that we're setting the execution policy to bypass is that these scripts and all that are not signed, and by default, Your host machine will probably have an execution policy of remote signed, expecting these to be signed, and these currently are not. So on your host machine, which is your lab box, we'll set it to bypass. It's okay for this situation. But here's what I want you to notice is I'm going to intentionally do this wrong the first time because you might run into this problem too. The instructions say open up PowerShell as an administrator. Sometimes if you don't have a lot of experience with PowerShell, you might not realize what that means. So let me show you what's going to happen. The instructions say open up PowerShell as administrator. Remember, I'm not doing this correctly right now. And then it says set the execution policy to bypass. I want you to see what's going to happen. It says, are you sure you want to do this? Because you are changing your execution policy. So I'm going to say yes and hit enter. I get an error message here, and it says that the change of this is denied. And the reason that it's denied is I didn't start this as run as administrator with that option. So if you run into this error, let me show you how to fix that. I'm going to close PowerShell, and I'm going to open it again. I'm going to right click, and I'm going to say run as administrator. Now when I run set execution policy for bypass, it'll work. And I want to point something out while I'm setting this. It's really important that anytime you work with the AutoLab, you make sure that you always open up as run as administrator for PowerShell. Now, if you're asking yourself and you're saying, hey, look, I'm looking at my host machine and I don't have a PowerShell icon here. Well, go over here to where it says, I'm Cortana, ask anything, and type in the word PowerShell, and you can, well, I got the word shell in. Let's try the word PowerShell. And you can launch this and pin it to your taskbar, which is what I do because I use it all the time. Once you have the execution policy set, then it says change to that extracted folder that you have and run setup host. But I want you to notice the syntax. It's a / setup host PS1. And that's going to be about as complicated as this is going to get. So let me go ahead. I'm going to do run as administrator. I'm going to change to that folder. And / setup. And the reason it's popping up so quick is I'm hitting the tab key. It's resolving it. And then you run this setup. First question is, do you want to change the default path? The default path for the AutoLab is AutoLab, but you can change that if you want. I don't want to change it, so I'm going to say no. It tells you what it's going to do. Now let's take a look at this. So that your host machine can talk to the virtual machines, we're going to set something called the trusted host to star. And then since this is just a lab environment, that's an okay security setting for this. It's going to install that lability module. Remember, lability is part of the infrastructure of this. It's also going to install Hyper-V. It's going to create the AutoLab folder for you, and then it's going to ask to be rebooted. So keep in mind, this won't take long to do, but if you have any open work, make sure you save that work before you have it reboot. So I'm going to hit enter. Now, as it's doing this installation, like I said, it's going to install Hyper-V. Now, one of the requirements is that you have Server 2016 or Windows 10, and Windows 10 needs to have a SLAT processor in it. Now, most computers made in the last 5 years do, but just check your computer requirements to make sure that's available. If Hyper-V fails to install on Windows 10, that might be the issue, and there's really no way around that. Once the installation is complete, you're ready to reboot, and then you're ready to start a config. But I do want to show you something else that might pop up on the screen. So as you notice here, it's saying that it needs to install a NuGet provider in order to get the lability module from PS Gallery. PS Gallery is an internet-based repository where a lot of the PowerShell modules are located, and you need to have the current NuGet provider installed. So if it asks you this question, say yes, and it'll continue on and do its installation. Now, shortly at the end of this, it'll stop and say, it's time for a reboot. Are you ready to reboot? And you just hit the enter key and it'll reboot your system. And with that, we're ready to come back and try to run a configuration. The process of installing the AutoLab has been pretty straightforward so far. We ended with step 6 here of running that setup host and rebooting our host machine. At this point, there's a couple of notes, and I'm going to show you these notes. It tells you what the default installation folder is, just as a reminder, and also tells you about some of the commands to run, but I'm going to show you those commands in a README file where you'll never forget what those commands are. Now, the next instruction is change to the configuration folder, the one that you want, choose the configuration that you want, and then check out the instructions. And this gives you a complete list of the commands, and it tells you how to look at it through PowerShell, get content instructions, and we'll do that. But I want you to notice this note down here. This note is about what's going to happen when you first run your very first lab. Now, here's the challenge. Think about everything that's going to have to be done here when this runs the very first lab configuration that you want it to do. It's got to download all the software. So what it's going to do by default is download evaluation versions of the ISOs. So if your configuration contains a client and a server, well, we've got to download those ISOs over the internet. It's also going to download some additional modules, which are very quick. And then it's going to start to create the virtual machines. Now, I have no way to estimate your internet connection, so I can't tell you how long it's going to take. I can tell you it's going to take a while because to download those ISO images does take a while, but you only need to go through that once. Any other future lab that you build using those ISO images, the ISOs are already downloaded, so you won't have to download those again. Also, I'll show you the folder structure in a little bit, but after the initial virtual machine creation, all future virtual machine creations are much faster, even with different configurations. So the first time you execute this, it's more than go get a cup of coffee. It's probably go out to lunch, go somewhere, watch a movie or something, and then come back, and then things will be set up for you. Every time after that, it's going to be much faster, and I think you're going to find that this is a much easier process overall than the old way. So let's go out and take a look at a configuration, how to find a configuration, and then how to see the instructions. So again, I'm going to open up PowerShell, and I'm going to do this as administrator. And the instructions say, hey, go to that AutoLab folder that got created. So it's AutoLab. And I'm going to get a directory listing here. And then you'll notice that there's a configurations folder under here. So I'm going to change to that configurations folder and do again a directory listing. And here's where you find all the configurations that come with the AutoLab. Now, some of these might be Pluralsight courses. Some of these might be just some test or proof of concepts that you can work with or play with. Here's an example of a Pluralsight course, one that I did, Microsoft PowerShell implementing GIA. Now, what if you're taking a Pluralsight course and the configuration is not here? Well, first of all, you have to ask whether the author is using the AutoLab or not. If they are, they'll probably tell you right up front when they're doing the video, or they'll give you some way of knowing that there is a configuration available. A couple of ways that they may make this available to you. They may include it here, and it might get updated into the AutoLab. Also, another place might be here at Pluralsight. Let me give you an example. I'm going to go out to the course, one of the courses I've done, the GIA course, and they might have put it here with the exercise files where you can just download the configuration. In this case, you want to download the configuration and put it into that configuration folder. They also may have an alternative place, maybe their own private place where they've put the configurations, which they'll give you information about if they are participating with using the AutoLab. So I've now see a bunch of configurations. Here's how you run a configuration. Now, I'm not going to run the GIA one, which is mine. I'm going to go out and run, let's do this proof of concept multi-role. So I'm going to change to that and do a dir. Now, what you're going to do is you're going to see a bunch of files out there. And here's the best part. You don't need to mess with any of these. They've already been configured for you. The one I want to point out to you, though, is the instructions. Now, these instructions are already on the README on GitHub. However, I wanted to make sure that you had them close by. So you can type get content and put in instructions, MD, and hit enter, and it'll give you the same instructions that are on the README. Now, what it tells you here is if you want to, you can just automate the entire setup, especially the first time, by running a command called unattend lab. And that's all you have to do. Now, if you want to run this one piece at a time, let me explain what the unattend lab does. It runs setup lab, which downloads all the files and creates the virtual machines. It also does this one, run lab, which starts the VMs. It also runs an enable internet access for the VMs and then runs a validation. And the reason I point this out is that you might want to, at some point, maybe you stopped the validation and you want to start the validation to know when the configurations are done. You can run these individually. But most cases, you'll probably just run unattended lab. So let's go ahead and do that. And let me show you what it looks like. I'm going to clear the screen and just type, well, not that, unattend lab, and I'm going to strike enter. Remember, you want to be in the location where your configuration exists. As this process runs, there's going to be a few things that you'll notice on the screen. First of all, you'll see progress bars of it in downloading the ISO images and installing different packages from the internet that it needs to make the lab run. You'll also see some instructions on the screen to explain to you what to do next once the lab is finished. Now, again, this could take a considerable amount of time the very first time you run it. But the real question is okay, when it's done, how do I know when it's done? And so why don't we take a look at that next, how you know that it's been validated and your lab has been completed successfully. So probably one of your first questions is going to be, now that I've run this configuration, how do I know when my virtual machines have been, well, completely configured? How do I know when it's all done and I can go to work? Well, what we did is we put in some testing scripts that will let you know when everything's done. Now, like I said, the very first time you run this, remember, you got to download the ISO files, all that kind of stuff. This can take several hours. But after that initial run, every time you start a configuration or even use a different configuration, it'll be much faster. But you still don't exactly know when that configuration has completed. Well, here's how you can tell. So if you see a screen similar to this, in other words, there's lots of green things being said that they exist, and down here at the bottom, tests that passed, 31 passed, and there's been no failures, that means that all of the virtual machines have completed their configuration and they're ready to go. Now, I do want to warn you that until you see this screen, you are going to see a series of red error messages flash by. And that's normal because that's these tests when they're failing right up until we get to the point to where they pass and you see something that looks just like this. Now, I also want to show you a couple of ways that you can access your virtual machines. You might be thinking that you want to use the hypervisor manager, and you can do that. So I'm going to go out here and show you where it is. It gets installed when Hyper-V got installed. It's down here at the bottom under Windows Administrative Tools, and you could call up the Hyper-V manager. And one of the ways that you can access the virtual machines from here is, well, like you would normally do through Hyper-V, which is when the list appears here, I'm going to select one, double click it, and then you can just connect to it. And I'm just going to say connect. And you can, once it connects, you can hit Control-Alt-Delete up here and you can sign in. That's one way. However, you know, one of the things is you probably won't need this hypervisor very much because I'm going to show you that we have ways of you starting the lab environment and shutting it down that's actually much better than doing anything with the hypervisor. So let me show you another way. And it's totally dependent upon whether the person that created the config added this support. Most of the configurations that you'll find with the AutoLab do support this. So you can run mstsc, and you're going to run the remote desktop connection. And then you can put in the name or the IP address of the machine that you want to connect to. Now, in most of the lab environments, you can remote into the client operating system. And by default, it's got an IP address of 192.168.3.100. What I like best about using the remote desktop connection over using the Hyper-V manager is you get a nice full screen connection right into your client machine in this case. And now you're ready to go to work. You can enter in your credentials. And now once you get this nice big screen that looks pretty and is ready for you to go to work in as soon as this signs in. Now, while it's doing this, I'm going to go ahead and minimize this. and show you just a little bit around of how this will benefit you after you've built your first config. So I'm going to do a dir here, and I just want you to kind of take notice of some of the folders that are underneath the AutoLab. The configurations, that's where all your configurations are. When you run it for the first time, the configuration is going to download the ISOs that are necessary and then build these master virtual hard disks that will be stored here. However, the second time you run a configuration, any configuration, it doesn't do these again. It checks to make sure that they already exist. So the only thing it has to do is build these very small virtual machines that are very quick to build. So once you make it past the first time again, it's much faster from that point forward. Now, you also might be asking, okay, I've got my lab, it's up and it's running. How do I manipulate it? How do I turn it off? How do I turn it back on? And is there a way that if I make some changes, I can revert it? And yes, there is, and that's what I want to show you next. Now that your lab environment is completely configured and ready to go, there's a few tasks that you're going to want to be able to do, such as, well, at the end of the day when I'm done, I want to shut down the lab environment, and then the next morning I want to start it back up. And really using the Hyper-V manager isn't a good option for this, and here's the reason why. There are several VMs that may need to be up and running before other VMs, and so the author of the configurations has already controlled that. Let me give you an example. The domain controller starts before all the other machines, which is a really good idea. So you want to have these management tasks taken care of for you so that you don't have to worry about it and think it through. And so we've already done that. I want to show you how to manage those. Also, something else very important. A lot of times you're making changes as you're learning something and adding things and removing things and, well, just changing the configuration. You might at some point say, gee, you know what? I just want this to get all cleaned up again. And so I can go back and start all over. I want to show you how to set up snapshotting as well. So to shut down the lab environment when you're done, there's a command called shutdown lab. Now, I've already shut the lab environment down, but because I wanted you to see something, it'll go through and shut it down in a prescribed sequence. In other words, usually all of the domain members will get shut down first, and then the domain controllers last, as an example. In this case, since I already had the lab environment turned off, I want you to notice this message. The virtual machine is already in the specified state. It says it's a warning, but it's more of just an informational piece to let you know that you already have the machines shut down. So shutdown lab will shut your lab environment down. What will start it back up? Well, let me clear the screen. Run lab. Now, I'm not going to execute this right now, but this will start the virtual machines in their prescribed sequence. So in this case, for this particular configuration example, the domain controller will start first, then followed by the other member machines. Now, that's easy enough to get your lab started and stopped. But what I want to do is I want to make sure that I can always go back to a nice, clean state. So I can do this. You can run snapshot lab. And when you run this, what it's going to do is it's going to make sure that your virtual machines are turned off, and then it's going to create a set of snapshots or checkpoints. And let me show you what that looks like in the Hyper-V manager. You may have seen this before. So for the machines, they're currently off. You now have a checkpoint. Now what that means is you can turn your lab environment back on with run-lab. You can make a whole bunch of changes and break things and have fun with things. Then you can go back and revert to this checkpoint. But rather than going into Hyper-V manager and doing it, let me show you another way to do it. And I always remind you about these commands here when you execute one of them. There's one called refresh lab. So after I have a checkpoint or I have a snapshot, I can run refresh lab. And what it'll do is it'll just basically reload that snapshot for us so that we have a nice, clean environment. Now, one of the things I want to point out to you is if you remember when we validate this, I was telling you that, you know, when the configuration ends, we let you know that it's done by running a validation script that shows you that all of your machines are configured. You can manually run that, and I'm going to clear the screen and start it. So if you've refreshed from a snapshot and you want to make sure that everything is the way it's supposed to be, you can always on your own run validate lab, and that runs the same testing scripts that was run during the initial configuration. And now it'll wait 5 minutes before it runs the first time, but then it'll run, and you'll see all of those green messages come back to you. about that your lab environment is ready to go, at which time you can just run run-lab and your lab environment will come back up. You can connect and start working again. At some point, you've reached the end of your needs of these VMs in this configuration, and you just want it to go away. You want to get rid of all of it. Well, I want to show you a couple of things. First of all, how to remove the lab environment, and then you can go to a different configuration and create a brand new one, a completely different one if you like, or you can bring this one back at any time. I also want to show you how to remove the AutoLab, which is pretty easy to do. It's basically, well, you delete the folder AutoLab. So that makes it pretty simple. But I want to show you that and remind you of the instructions and kind of close things out here. So to get rid of a lab environment, you'll need to be in the configuration folder that you built that lab environment from. And then it's pretty simple. You type wipe lab. Now, what is it going to actually do? What it's going to do is, and let me show you here graphically for a second, because I'm not going to execute this, but let me show you where those files are that it's going to wipe when you do this. So I'm going to go to my PC under the C drive, under AutoLab. And I showed you these folders earlier, but these little virtual hard disks that are out there, this is what wipe lab is going to remove. It's not going to remove these base images, which are the big images of the virtual machines, and it's not going to remove the ISOs. The benefit to that is, since it's only removing these little stubs off there, is that you can rebuild this lab really quick, or you can rebuild any other lab from any other of the configurations that you may have. So we did this one, the multi-row one. You can now build maybe the Geo one, and it'll build it really quick for you. Now, what if you don't want to just get rid of the lab, you want to get rid of AutoLab? Well, AutoLab itself is just a bunch of files on your disk. So to get rid of it, all you have to do is right-click and delete the folder AutoLab. That'll get rid of all of the ISOs, the big virtual machine images, all the configurations, everything goes away. Now, the only remaining piece on your client machine is, or your host machine, is that you do have Hyper-V installed, and you can remove Hyper-V with either going into Control Panel for Windows 10, or you can remove the feature if you're running on Server 2016. Now that pretty much sets us up for using the AutoLab, and I think you're going to find that this can make your life quite a bit easier and take a lot of the time consumption out of building these lab environments. But just to keep a few things in mind that we've looked at. We've looked at things like where to find the AutoLab, and I'm going to remind you of this in just a minute, how to get it downloaded and installed, how to configure your very first lab, how to verify it, start, stop, and manage it, and how to remove it. And really the first note out of this, and I've said it several times, is the very first time you run this, yep, it's going to take a long time, but as you work with other configurations, after that first time, it's going to be pretty easy. Now, I know that the commands, reminding yourself of what the commands for configuring and starting and stopping the AutoLab can be kind of confusing at first. Well, that's why every time you run a command, I'll tell you what the next commands are, and I want to remind you of something else. Don't forget the website. And again, the URL for the website out on GitHub, and we have this README attached to it. So check out the README because some things may change. We may add some additional features to it, but down here in this README, we always have the instructions so that you can get started and be successful at using the AutoLab. A couple of additional notes is that while you're working with the AutoLab, this is a work in progress. So check back often. We'll have newer versions out that'll include new features and some bug fixes. If you run across a problem and you have an issue or something that doesn't make sense, go ahead and come out here and post an issue here in issues and tell us what seems to be the problem or what you've run across, or maybe you found that, hey, it would be really cool if it did this. Could you add this feature? Feel free to come out here and contribute and add to it, and we'll follow the conversations and we'll take a look at what those issues are and respond back. Also, you can, if you are into desired state configuration and writing configs, or if you want to work on this project too, you can also do a fork from this project and work on it and contribute directly back to the entire project. We really appreciate all the help that we can get. And with that, I hope you enjoy working with the AutoLab. Keep in touch and feel free to contribute to, well, our project that we're working on.